My uncle looked me dead in the eye and told me I didn't deserve a single penny. What he didn't know was that my grandmother had been planning her revenge for 12 years, and I was about to inherit everything. Let me take you back to where it all began, because the day my grandmother died, I thought I'd lost the only person who ever really saw me. Eleanor Chun was 92 years old when her heart finally gave out on a Tuesday morning in April. I found out the way I found out about most family news, third hand, through a cold text message from my cousin Blake. Grandma's gone. Funeral Saturday. Don't be late. No emotion. No warmth. Just another obligation for the family disappointment to fulfill. That's what I was to them, you see. The disappointment. The burden. The charity case they'd been stuck with ever since my parents died in a car accident when I was 7 years old. My name is Olivia Chin, and for the last 18 years, I've been the ghost at every family gathering, the afterthought at every holiday, the granddaughter who should just be grateful for whatever scraps the real family decided to throw my way. The funeral was held at Riverside Memorial, one of those pristine establishments where even grief has to follow a dress code. I wore the only black dress I owned, the one I'd bought at a thrift store for my college graduation that none of them attended. The parking lot was full of expensive cars, my Uncle Victor's Mercedes, Aunt Patricia's Range Rover, Cousin Blake's Tesla that Grandma had helped him buy. I pulled up in my 12-year-old Honda Civic with the check engine light permanently glowing like a beacon of my inadequacy. Inside, the viewing room was packed with people I barely recognized. Business associates. Country club friends. The mayor was there. But I noticed something immediately. While everyone else clustered in groups, exchanging stories about how wonderful Eleanor was, how much they'd miss her, how generous she'd been, I was alone. Not a single person approached me. Not one distant relative offered a hug or even a sympathetic smile. I might as well have been invisible. I found a seat in the back row, clutching the only thing that mattered to me, a worn recipe card my grandmother had given me 3 years ago. Handwritten in her shaky cursive, Olivia's lemon bars. She'd tucked it into my hand during one of our weekly Tuesday visits and said, "This was your mother's favorite. I want you to have it." That card was worth more to me than anything else in that room. Uncle Victor stood at the front, delivering the eulogy. He spoke about duty and family legacy, about how Eleanor had built an empire and how proud she was of her children and grandchildren. He didn't mention me once. Not once. When he talked about the grandchildren she'd helped shape into successful adults, his eyes swept past me like I was part of the furniture. Blake, her golden boy, got a full paragraph. I got silence. But here's what Victor and the rest of them didn't know. While they were attending mandatory holiday dinners and showing up only when it was convenient, I was there every single Tuesday for 6 years. Every Tuesday, I'd drive 40 minutes to Grandma's house, and we'd sit in her garden. We'd talk about books and flowers and sometimes about Mom. Grandma never made me feel like a burden. She never made me feel like I owed her gratitude for existing. She just made me feel seen. The week after the funeral dragged by like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I went back to my job as a junior editor at a small publishing house, pushing papers and fixing other people's semicolons for $38,000 a year. My apartment was a studio in the kind of neighborhood where you heard your neighbors' entire lives through paper-thin walls. I'd learned to live small, to want less, to expect nothing. It was safer that way. Then came the email from Harrison and Associates. Formal will reading, Friday 2 p.m. Attendance mandatory. I stared at my phone screen, my stomach twisting into knots. I knew what was coming. I'd be mentioned, probably for some token amount that Victor would frame as generous while reminding everyone what a burden I'd been. The family would nod along, and I'd smile and say thank you because that's what I'd been trained to do. Accept. Endure. Disappear. Friday arrived too quickly. The law office was downtown, all glass and steel and leather furniture that probably cost more than my annual rent. I was the last to arrive because I'd spent 20 minutes in my car trying to convince myself to go inside. The conference room was massive, dominated by a table that could seat 20 people. Victor sat at the head like a king holding court, Patricia beside him wearing pearls and expression of practiced sympathy. Blake sprawled in his chair, scrolling through his phone. There were other cousins, other relatives, all arranged by importance. And then there was me, in the chair closest to the door. The escape route. Leonard Harrison was exactly what you'd expect from a 70-year-old estate attorney. Silver hair, expensive suit, the kind of measured voice that made everything sound official and final. He opened a leather portfolio and began reading. I stopped listening to the specific amounts after a while. It was all noise. Victor received the house, Grandma's beautiful Victorian with the wraparound porch and the garden I'd helped maintain. $3 million worth of property and memories. Patricia received the investment portfolio. Blake and the other grandchildren each received trust funds worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Then Harrison cleared his throat and looked directly at me. To my granddaughter, Olivia Chun, I leave the sum of $5,000 and my complete collection of gardening books. $5,000. The room went quiet, but it wasn't a respectful quiet. It was the quiet of people trying not to laugh. I felt my face burning, my hands gripping the armrests of my chair so hard my knuckles went white. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, please hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I see every single comment, and it means the world to me. Thank you so much for your support. Now back to the story. I should have left right then. I should have stood up, held my head high, and walked out. But I was frozen, trapped in that terrible moment, and that's when Victor decided to twist the knife. He stood up, pushing his chair back with deliberate slowness. Every eye in the room turned to him. He looked at me, and I saw something in his expression that made my blood run cold. Satisfaction. Pure, undiluted satisfaction. I'm glad Mother finally saw reason, he began, his voice carrying across the silent room. Olivia, I don't say this to be cruel, but someone needs to be honest with you. You didn't deserve anything from this estate. You barely visited our mother. Once a week? Please. Some of us called her every day. Some of us included her in our lives in meaningful ways. My throat closed up. I couldn't breathe. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. But Victor wasn't finished. He was just getting started. You've been a taker your entire life. After your parents died, God rest their souls, you became Mother's burden. We all know it. She was too kind to say it, but raising you drained her. The boarding school, the expenses, the constant worry. And what did you give back? Tuesday afternoon visits where you'd sit in her garden and take. Patricia nodded along. Blake didn't even look up from his phone. The other relatives shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. No one defended me. No one spoke up. $5,000 is more than generous for someone who contributed nothing to this family, Victor continued. Frankly, I'm relieved Mother came to her senses before she passed. You should be grateful for what you received, not sitting there looking like you're owed something more. The room swam. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of them. I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the floor, the sound cutting through Victor's monologue. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. If I opened my mouth, I'd shatter into 1,000 pieces right there on that expensive carpet. I walked out. Down the hallway. Into the elevator. Through the lobby. I made it to my car before the first sob broke free. I drove home on autopilot, my vision blurred with tears I'd held in for 18 years. Not tears for the money, I'd never expected money, but tears for what Victor's words meant. That maybe Grandma had agreed with him. That maybe I really had been nothing but a burden. That the only person who I thought loved me had actually resented me all along, and those Tuesday afternoons had been just another obligation she'd been too polite to refuse. I spent the next 3 days in my apartment, calling in sick to work, eating nothing, staring at the ceiling. The recipe card sat on my nightstand, and I couldn't even look at it. Had that been pity too? Had everything been pity? Wednesday morning, I dragged myself to the mailbox, hoping for nothing more than the usual bills and junk mail. But there, among the credit card offers and grocery store flyers, was a certified letter. The return address made my heart skip. Hendricks and Associates, attorneys at law. Not Harrison. A different firm entirely. I tore it open right there in the hallway, my hands shaking. The letter was brief, formal, and completely bewildering. Dear Ms. Chun, you are hereby requested to attend a private meeting regarding the estate of Eleanor Chun, secondary documentation. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to schedule an appointment. This matter is time-sensitive and confidential. Regards, Margaret Hendricks, Senior Partner. Secondary documentation. What did that even mean? Grandma's will had been read. Everything had been decided. I'd been dismissed and humiliated, and it was over. Wasn't it? I called the number with trembling fingers. A receptionist answered, professional and warm, and when I gave my name she said, "Oh yes, Ms. Chun. Mrs. Hendricks has been expecting your call. Can you come in tomorrow at 10? I said yes before my brain could catch up to my mouth. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Grandma's face during our last visit, 2 weeks before she died. She'd been tired, her voice weaker than usual, but she'd held my hand and said something I hadn't understood at the time. "Livy baby, I need you to trust me. Even when it doesn't make sense, trust that I loved you more than anything in this world." I'd thought she was just being sentimental. Old people get that way near the end. But what if she'd been trying to tell me something? What if Tuesday mornings in the garden weren't the whole story? What if Victor's cruelty wasn't the ending? So here's my question for you, before we dive into what happened next. If someone you loved made you look like a fool in front of everyone, but you later discovered it was part of a bigger plan, could you forgive them for the pain they put you through? Could you trust that the humiliation had a purpose? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because what I discovered the next day would change everything I thought I knew about my grandmother, my family, and the last 12 years of my life. I walked into Margaret Hendricks' office expecting answers. What I got instead was a sealed envelope that would destroy everything my uncle had built his life on. The offices of Hendricks and Associates weren't like Harrison's corporate fortress downtown. This was a converted brownstone in the historic district, the kind of place where old money went to keep its secrets. Margaret Hendricks herself answered the door, a woman in her early 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen every trick in the book and invented a few of their own. "Olivia," she said, and the way she said my name made it sound like she already knew my entire life story. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit down. What I'm about to show you is going to be difficult to process." She slid a leather document folder across her mahogany desk. My hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside was a will. Not just any will, a will dated 12 years ago, just 3 months after I'd been shipped off to boarding school. At the top, in official legal language, it read, "The last will and testament of Eleanor Marie Chun, secondary disposition." Secondary disposition? I whispered. What does that mean? Margaret leaned forward, her expression serious. "It means your grandmother drafted 2 wills. The one that was read last week was real, legally binding, and designed to be executed first. This one," she tapped the folder, "was sealed with very specific instructions. It could only be opened if the first will was read, executed, and accepted without legal challenge." My brain couldn't process what she was saying. Why would she do that? "Read it," Margaret said simply. "Then you'll understand." I read. And with every line, my entire world tilted on its axis. The bulk of Eleanor Chen's estate, the Victorian house, the investment accounts, the stocks, the bonds, everything that Victor thought he'd won, it all went to me. Every single asset except for 2 small provisions. Victor would receive exactly $5,000 and Patricia would receive the gardening book collection. The reversal was so perfect, so deliberate, it couldn't be accidental. But that wasn't even the most shocking part. There was a clause, buried in the legal language, that made my blood run cold. Should Victor Chen or Patricia Chen contest this will in any way, their inheritances shall be forfeit entirely, and their portions shall be donated to the American Cancer Society in memory of David and Jennifer Chen. My parents. Grandma had built a trap. And Victor had walked right into it. "There's more," Margaret said, pulling out a sealed letter. "She left this for you." My grandmother's handwriting swam before my eyes as tears blurred my vision. I'm going to read you exactly what she wrote, because these words changed everything. "My dearest Livy, if you're reading this, then my plan worked. I know the last week has been torture for you, and I'm so sorry for that. But I needed the truth to reveal itself, and the only way to see people's true nature is to give them exactly what they want and watch what they do with it. Victor showed you who he really is. He always does when he thinks he's won. I sent you away to boarding school not because you were a burden, sweetheart, but because I saw what Victor was becoming, and I couldn't let him poison you the way he'd been poisoned by greed. Every Tuesday you came to see me, you proved what I already knew, you loved me for me, not for what I could give you. You were the only one who ever did. The money isn't a reward, Livy. It's a responsibility. Use it to build the life your parents would have wanted for you. And remember, the best revenge isn't cruelty. It's becoming everything they said you couldn't be. I love you forever, Grandma. I couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. Everything I'd believed about myself, about my worth, about those Tuesday afternoons, it had all been real. Victor's words at the will reading had been lies. Cruel, calculated lies. There's something else you need to see, Margaret said, pulling out a manila folder that looked like it had been sitting in a safe for years. Your grandmother was a meticulous woman. She documented everything. Inside that folder was a horror show of evidence spanning more than a decade. Bank statements showing that Victor had embezzled nearly $200,000 from Grandma's accounts over 5 years, moving money in small increments he thought she wouldn't notice. She'd noticed. She'd tracked every penny. There were investment documents for Victor's business ventures, companies that didn't exist, partnerships that were just fronts for covering his gambling debts. Grandma had funded them knowing they were scams, watching him dig his own grave. But the worst part, the part that made rage burn hot in my chest, was a stack of letters. Victor had written to Grandma's friends, to distant relatives, even to the boarding school administrators. Each letter was a carefully crafted poison pill, painting me as troubled, ungrateful, manipulative. Olivia only visits to secure her inheritance, one letter claimed. She's caused Eleanor so much heartache. Another suggested I had behavioral issues that made me unsuitable for family gatherings. He'd systematically isolated me, cut me off from anyone who might have been an ally. And Grandma had kept every single piece of evidence. Why didn't she expose him? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Why did she let him get away with it? Margaret's smile was sharp. Because exposure would have been too easy. Your grandmother wanted something better. She wanted him to condemn himself with his own words. And he did, didn't he? At the will reading, in front of witnesses, he told you that you deserved nothing. That you were a burden. That $5,000 was generous. The implications hit me like a freight train. So when I execute this will. When you execute this will, Margaret interrupted, Victor loses everything. The house he's already planning to sell. The money he's already spent in his head. All of it goes to you. And because of that contestation clause, if he fights it, he gets nothing. Not even the $5,000. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt terrified. Because executing this will meant war. It meant confronting my entire family. It meant becoming visible in a way I'd spent my whole life avoiding. I need time to think, I managed. You have 30 days, Margaret said. After that, the secondary will expires and the first will stands. Your grandmother gave you a choice, Olivia. She didn't force your hand. But I'll tell you what I told her when she drafted this. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let the truth come to light. I left that office with the folder clutched to my chest, my mind reeling. I drove without thinking, and somehow ended up at Grandma's house, Victor's house now, or so he thought. The garden was already looking neglected. The roses I'd helped plant were wilting. The bird feeders were empty. That's when I saw him. An older black man in worn jeans and a sun-faded shirt, kneeling by the flower beds with a trowel in his hand. He looked up as I approached, and his weathered face broke into a sad smile. You must be Olivia, he said. I'm James. I was your grandmother's gardener. We sat on the porch swing, the same swing where Grandma and I had shared countless conversations, and James told me things I'd never known. He'd worked for Grandma for 30 years. He'd been there the day my parents died. He'd watched Victor transform from ambitious young man into something darker. She talked about you all the time, James said. After you'd leave on Tuesday afternoons, she'd sit right here and tell me about your conversations. She said you were the only one who reminded her of your mother. Same kindness. Same quiet strength. I don't feel strong, I admitted. I feel like I'm about to fall apart. James was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You want to know something? I was one of the witnesses when your grandmother signed that second will. Me and Margaret. Eleanor made me promise not to tell you unless you came here after learning about it. She said if you came to the garden, it meant you were ready. Ready for what? To stop hiding, he said simply. Your grandmother didn't leave you money, Olivia. She left you the truth. What you do with it, whether you speak up or stay silent, that's what defines who you are. Before we continue, If you're enjoying this story and you want to see how Olivia gets her revenge, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment telling me what you would do in Olivia's situation. Would you execute the will and face your family, or would you walk away and keep the peace? I read every single comment. Now, let's get back to the story. I spent the next week diving into those documents like a detective investigating a cold case. Every night after work, I'd spread them across my tiny apartment floor and piece together the full scope of Victor's betrayal. And it was so much worse than I'd thought. I found proof that after my parents died, their life insurance policy had paid out $500,000. It was supposed to go into a trust for my education and care. Victor, as my legal guardian, had been appointed trustee. He told me that the money had gone into administrative costs and proper care facilities. It was a lie. He'd taken it. Every penny. He'd funneled it through shell companies, paid off his debts, bought his Mercedes. My parents' death had been profitable for him. I made copies of everything. I organized it chronologically. And then I did something I'd never done before. I made a plan. Not a passive plan where I hoped things would work out. An active plan. A trap. I called Margaret. I want to execute the will, I told her. But I want to do it my way. She listened as I explained, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she laughed, actually laughed. Your grandmother would have loved this. When do you want to do it? This Saturday, I said. At the house. I sent a group text to the entire family. I need to speak with everyone about Grandma's inheritance and my gratitude for everything you've done for me. Please meet at the house Saturday at 2 p.m. It's important. Victor responded immediately, Of course, Olivia. We're glad you're being reasonable about all this. Reasonable. The word tasted like ash. Saturday arrived with storm clouds gathering on the horizon, which felt almost too perfectly symbolic. I got to Grandma's house early, letting myself in with the key I'd never returned. Everything looked the same but felt different, like I was seeing it through new eyes. They arrived in a caravan of expensive cars. Victor first, of course, his expression magnanimous, the benevolent uncle ready to accept his wayward niece's gratitude. Patricia beside him, clutching her pearls. Blake slouching behind them, probably wondering why he had to waste his Saturday on this. Other cousins and relatives filed in, filling up the living room. I stood in front of the fireplace, my hands shaking but my voice steady. Thank you all for coming. I know you're busy, and I appreciate you taking the time. Victor waved his hand dismissively. Of course, Olivia. Family is important. Now, what did you want to say? This was it. The moment of truth. I could still back out. I could thank them and disappear back into invisibility. It would be easier. Safer. But then I saw James through the window, tending to the roses. And I thought about Grandma, sitting on that porch swing, watching and waiting and believing I'd find my voice when it mattered. I wanted to talk about honesty, I began. About truth. About what this family really is beneath all the expensive cars and nice clothes. Victor's expression shifted, just slightly. Olivia, what are you? I'm talking, Uncle Victor. For once in my life, I'm talking, and you're going to listen. The room went dead silent. No one had ever spoken to Victor that way. Especially not me. And that's when everything started to unravel. But here's what I want to know from you, before I tell you what happened next. Have you ever been in a moment where you knew speaking up would change everything, but staying silent would destroy you from the inside? When the cost of your voice felt impossibly high, but the cost of your silence was even higher. Because standing in that living room, surrounded by people who'd spent years making me feel worthless, I understood something crucial. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to stay small just because other people are comfortable with your silence. What came next would either free me or break me. And there was only one way to find out which. Would you believe me if I told you that the moment I finally found my voice was the same moment my uncle lost everything he'd spent 12 years stealing? The living room felt smaller with everyone packed in, all eyes on me, all of them waiting for me to thank them and disappear back into the shadows where I belonged. But I wasn't that person anymore. That version of Olivia had died the moment I read my grandmother's letter. I wanted to talk about honesty, I continued, watching Victor's face carefully. About what happens when someone mistakes kindness for weakness. When someone thinks that silence means surrender. Victor stood up abruptly. Olivia, if you're upset about the will, we can discuss a small increase to your inheritance. No need to be dramatic. Sit down, Uncle Victor. The command in my voice surprised even me. Victor actually hesitated, caught off guard, before slowly lowering himself back into his chair. Blake's phone was forgotten in his lap. Patricia's hand clutched her pearls, so tight her knuckles were white. The thing about truth, I said, pulling the manila folder from my bag, is that it doesn't stay buried forever. Grandma understood that. She knew that given enough rope, some people will hang themselves with their own words. I opened the folder and pulled out the first document, a bank statement with highlighted transfers. On March 15, 6 years ago, you transferred $43,000 from Grandma's savings account to an LLC called Victor Enterprises. Do you remember that, Uncle Victor? His face went pale. That was a legitimate investment. Victor Enterprises doesn't exist, I interrupted. It's a shell company you created to funnel money to cover your gambling debts. Grandma knew. She tracked every transaction, every lie. I held up the statement. She documented everything. The room erupted. Relatives started talking over each other. Patricia turned to Victor with betrayal written across her face. Blake finally looked up from his phone, his expression stunned. That's not all, I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. My parents' life insurance policy paid out $500,000 when they died. Uncle Victor, as my guardian and trustee, told everyone it went to administrative costs and my care. Would you like to know where it actually went? Victor shot to his feet. You have no right to accuse me. I have every right. My voice cracked like thunder. You stole my parents' legacy. You spent years telling me I was a burden while you were stealing the money they left to take care of me. You bought your Mercedes with my father's death benefits. You paid for Blake's Tesla with my mother's life insurance. Blake's face went ghost white. Dad? Is that true? But I wasn't done. I pulled out the letters, the ones Victor had written, poisoning everyone against me. And while you were stealing from me, you were also destroying my reputation. Letters to Grandma's friends, to distant relatives, to my boarding school, all painting me as unstable, ungrateful, manipulative. You systematically isolated me from anyone who might have helped me. I read excerpts aloud, my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest. With each word, I watched Victor's carefully constructed world crumble. Other relatives were pulling out their phones, some recording, some already texting. The court of public opinion was in session, and the verdict was coming fast. You stood in that lawyer's office, I continued, and you told me I deserved nothing. That I was a taker. That $5,000 was generous. Do you remember that, Uncle Victor? He said nothing. For the first time in my life, Victor Chen had nothing to say. Well, I have news for you. Grandma drafted a second will 12 years ago. A real will, legally binding, that she sealed with very specific instructions. I watched the blood drain completely from Victor's face as understanding dawned. No, he whispered. Yes, I said. The will that was read last week? That was a test. Grandma wanted to see how you'd behave when you thought you'd won. And you showed everyone exactly who you are. Margaret Hendricks stepped through the doorway. I'd called her before anyone arrived. She carried an official document case. Victor Chen, Patricia Chen, I'm here to officially notify you that a secondary will has been executed as of this morning. Per the terms of Eleanor Chen's estate. The house is mine, I said quietly. The investments, the accounts, everything. All of it. You get $5,000, Uncle Victor. And Patricia, you get the gardening books. The reversal wasn't lost on anyone. Several relatives actually gasped. Victor lunged toward me, his face purple with rage, but James appeared, steady, solid James, blocking his path. I wouldn't do that, James said calmly. There are witnesses. And Ms. Chen has already filed a report about the embezzlement. You can't do this. Victor shouted. I'll fight it. I'll contest that will. Margaret's smile was razor-sharp. I was hoping you'd say that. The will contains a contestation clause. If you challenge it in any way, you forfeit your entire inheritance. Every penny goes to the American Cancer Society in your sister and brother-in-law's names. So please, by all means, contest it. The trap snapped shut. Victor stood there, shaking with impotent rage, realizing he'd been outmaneuvered by a dead woman and the granddaughter he'd spent years underestimating. Patricia was the first to break. She turned to Victor, her voice cold. You told me that money was for business investments. You told me we were helping family. She looked at me, tears streaming down her face. Olivia, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. Some of us knew, Aunt Lauren spoke up from the back. Mom's younger sister, someone I barely knew because Victor had cut her off years ago. Eleanor told me 3 years ago that Victor was stealing from her, but she asked me to stay quiet. She said she had a plan. Lauren looked at me with something like pride. I'm glad you found your voice, Olivia. Your mother would be so proud. One by one, the relatives who'd enabled Victor's cruelty started backing away from him, rearranging their loyalties in real time. Blake stood up, looked at his father with disgust, and walked out without a word. Others followed. Victor was left standing alone in the center of the room, the king who'd lost his kingdom. I'm offering you a choice, I said, my voice steady. You can accept the terms of the will quietly, sign an agreement to repay the embezzled funds in installments, and we never speak of this again. Or I can prosecute you for fraud, embezzlement, and theft. The evidence is ironclad. You'll go to prison. You wouldn't, Victor hissed. Try me, I said. And I meant it. The girl who'd hidden in the back of the funeral was gone. In her place stood someone who'd learned that justice and kindness aren't opposites, they're partners. Victor signed the agreement that afternoon. Patricia left him 2 weeks later. Blake reached out to me through email, apologizing for years of complicity, though we both knew sorry couldn't fix what was broken. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal paperwork, financial transfers, and slow, careful healing. I moved into Grandma's house, my house now, and the first thing I did was restore the garden with James's help. We planted new roses, filled the bird feeders, brought life back to the space. I established a scholarship fund in my parents' names for kids who'd lost parents and needed help with education. I converted part of the house into a community art space, something Grandma had always wanted to do but never had the chance. And I kept those gardening books in the library, right next to the recipe card for lemon bars. One evening, 3 months after everything changed, I sat on the porch swing with James, watching the sun set over the garden. Do you think she knew how it would all turn out? I asked. James smiled. Eleanor? She didn't know. But she believed. There's a difference. She believed you'd find your strength when you needed it most. And she was right. I visited Grandma's grave the next day, bringing fresh flowers from the garden. I knelt by the headstone and whispered, You taught me that being kind doesn't mean being weak. That staying quiet doesn't mean having nothing to say. And that the best revenge isn't cruelty, it's becoming exactly who you were meant to be, despite everyone who tried to make you small. The stone was cold under my hand, but I felt warmth anyway. Love doesn't end just because someone's gone. It transforms. It becomes memory, lesson, legacy. I thought about Victor, living in a modest apartment now, his reputation in ruins, his family scattered. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt something gentler. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of release. His cruelty no longer defined me. His words no longer had power. Standing up, I looked back at the house, my house, glowing in the afternoon light. The community art space was opening next week, and I'd invited everyone. Even Victor. Not because I'd forgiven him, but because I wanted him to see what he could never destroy, my ability to build something beautiful from the ashes of his hate. Because that's the thing about revenge that no one tells you. The sweetest revenge isn't making your enemies suffer. It's proving them wrong. It's taking everything they said you couldn't be and becoming it anyway. It's standing in the wreckage of their cruelty and building a garden. Grandma knew that. She'd lived it. And now finally so did I. So here's what I want you to do. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated or made to feel small, drop a comment telling me about a time you found your voice. When did you stop accepting other people's version of who you were? When did you decide that your worth wasn't up for debate? Share your story, because someone out there needs to hear it. Someone needs to know they're not alone. Hit that subscribe button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and remember, being quiet doesn't mean you have nothing to say. Sometimes it means you're waiting for the perfect moment to speak. And when that moment comes, make it count. I'll see you in the next story.